Thank you, Air Chief Marshal. Yes, let's get straight into deterrence, dig a lot deeper and look at the how do we do it rather than just why we want to do it. So to do that, I'm really pleased to say we have an expert panel, a really expert panel to look at this. So please do welcome, first of all, Dr. Viktoriya Fedorchak, who is Associate Senior Lecturer in War Studies from the Swedish Defence University, a leading air power academic who is Ukrainian and has just returned from conducting field work in Ukraine. So welcome, Viktoriya. Hi, do take a seat. Also, please do welcome Air Marshal Allan Marshal, the RAF's Air and Space Commander. Welcome. And please do also welcome Dr. Nicola Leveringhaus, Senior Lecturer from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome, Nicola. So as we've had in previous sessions, we're going to set the scene a little bit. I'm going to hand over to Viktoriya, who's going to explain a little bit more about fieldwork in Ukraine and the overall picture as well. So over to you.
Thank you. Will I get a...
Oh, here we are.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Cool. Okay. Do stop me if I go over time. Good at this stage, what, afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and to address this distinguished audience. I have the topic of talking about deterrence in Ukraine. If I was talking just about deterrence in Ukraine, it would have been a very short presentation, probably like, yeah, deterrence in Ukraine didn't work, end of the story. However, there are various aspects we can consider when we're referring about lessons learned, points for considerations in terms of why things didn't work, what could have worked in Ukraine, and something we can derive for the current strategic environment, but also for the strengthening of the resilience of the armed forces across the world. So we'll talk about various aspects there. But first of all, when we discuss deterrence in Ukraine in general, why there wasn't one, or if there was one, why did it fail? Well, I like Justin's presentation, especially the point when he mentioned that air forces are a great means for deterrence. And indeed, when you have sufficient numbers of the Air Force, or if you have sufficient numbers of assets across domains, say, and you can pull them together to have strategic effects or layered effects, then you can at least pose a certain threat to your potential adversary, or in our case, enemy. And in this case, what was happening in the Ukraine in the 1990s, obviously there was the process of disarmament, so that was the external factor contributing to the reduction of any potential deterrence in Ukraine. And another factor were actually the internal lack of continuity in the internal leadership in terms of how the armed forces should be transformed. So in this case, we observed changes of the government, that some of them would be more pro-Russian, others would be more pro-Western, so you would have a roller coaster in terms of how their armed forces and actually defense should be developing in Ukraine. So these are two factors that one can argue contributed to the lack or inefficient nature of deterrence in Ukraine. Not to mention that we're talking about Russia and, yeah. Okay. Working. Yeah, it's working. A few points I would like to focus on. So after what we observed that is happening in Ukraine, it is important to consider that what you're going to do when the attack happens, what you're going to do on the day zero, how you're going to survive the first day. We've spoken about short-term, long-term planning. This is all very great. However, how are you going to survive the contact with the enemy on the first day? Some of the things important to consider is that we've seen the supremacy of different technologies during the warfighting in Ukraine. We've seen the importance of GBATs. We've seen what's happening with the Western advanced technologies. Their role in warfighting over the last 2.5 years. However, it is the question, what are you going to do? And some of the lessons learned, the point of considerations are that you do need to have integrated air and missile defenses. Not just coming from one source, you need diversity and you need them to function as a system. Another point in this case is we need to look into something that saved Ukraine on the day one, and this is dispersal. I'll talk about it a little bit later when we'll see how much time I'm going to have for that. But for day one, dispersal was a way to make Ukrainian Air Force to survive the contact with the enemy, but also we see its adaptation across different units, across different domains in the last 2.5 years. In the last 6 months, last 6 months, let's talk about Russian offensive in Kharkiv. We see Russians are adopting the principles of dispersal as well across their units, across their artillery assets. So it is something that is there to be at the beginning of their engagement with the enemy, but also to be present later on when you adapt to the war-fighting environment. The third point is actually refers to the importance of having sufficient numbers and having your industry being tuned to the war-fighting situation. It's nice to talk about the long-term planning in the peacetime, and we are in the peacetime in the Western countries, which is excellent. However, when you are in the warfighting and you need this ammunition, so you need your entire economy to be readjusted for the warfighting, the question is, how do you do that? Well, you find solutions because you have no other choice. So important thing is that these days we don't have any safe haven in the warfighting. Whether we talk about civilians, whether we talk about military, it doesn't really matter, because even if you have sufficient integrated air and missile defenses, GBADs, great marvels of contemporary technologies, there is still the question what you're going to prioritize. The bigger your country is, the greater the enemy is, the more you're going to need to invest, the more you're going to need to prioritize, and you need to make those decisions. Battle space is becoming more and more transparent, and that doesn't really change. Yes, and another thing here, you need to build up resilience for your people. You need to make sure that your society is prepared for that. Someone mentioned, how do you start with building, how do you build resilience of society? Sweden has an interesting take on resilience. So traditionally, with the total defense, they had various pillars of how do you build total defense. One of those pillars would be psychological one. And one of the arguments we were discussing over some time is that resilience actually starts with an individual. When people actually realize they need to do stuff on the daily basis to contribute to the common good, to make sure that they survive, make sure that their society carries on. So individual, society, this is where we have the sources for the psychological resilience and overall resilience of a society. Changes of Russian tactics, why it is important. It is important because when you see the significant advancement of the Western technologies in Ukraine, how they contributed to survival of the nation and actually armed forces, what we see these days that Russians are adapting. They're adapting pretty fast, and there are lots of articles right now appearing more and more about these adaptations. So in this case, it's important to realize that some of the discussions concluded you need to target the problem at the source. And it also refers to the deterrent. Can you target the problem at the source? I'll keep it that way. Dispersal in Ukraine. There will be more discussions on dispersal, of course, when there will be a panel with the Nordic chiefs of staff and commanders of Air Force. But the point here is that what was the dispersal in Ukraine, how it was relevant, how it provided ways to survival. Dispersal doesn't come out of the blue. Like anything, you need to prepare for that. In Ukraine, preparation was over a few years of the interim warfighting years, so we're talking about 2014-15 to 2022. In this case, various units were dispersed. There were preparations in terms of what pilots could be doing. There were preparations and training of how you can adjust your infrastructure to make it more mobile. So these are things that they were not that costly. They were probably more passive defenses, but they were in place, so we actually had some Air Force at the end of the day. What else to think about? Obviously, it's the matter of how do you harmonize communication. There were different solutions in the case of Ukraine. These days, something more advanced and systematic apps are being developed to improve that. Previously, things were a bit more sporadic, not so systematic, not so well organized, some would argue. Finally, the question of interoperability. We talk about services, which is great. We talk about domains. The problem is when you really fight in the war of survival, you realize how important it is to have everyone together, because if you don't have sufficient assets in one domain or in one service, you pull them from another. But the question is for how long you can do it. We've seen for 2.5 years that Ukraine could actually do it, but now many assets, many services, many resources are being drained. So as a result, you see how a long-term over-reliance on one type of capabilities can undermine your overall system of defense. And I'm definitely running out of time. The last one, I'm an academic, I need to say what I'm actually doing. So this is the last book that I've written, and this is on Russia-Ukraine war. I'm looking at the context of the war, looking a bit into history, but also interim years. The most kind of important thing here is that we're looking at the cross-domain, looking into different services, not just Air Force, and also resilience of the Ukrainian nation. Thanks to the Swedish Defense University, it's a free of charge online download. You can find it on the Routledge official website. Feel free to download it if you're interested in the topic. And my favorite slide, questions, suggestions, complaints. Bring it on.
I'm sure we will have some very shortly. Thank you very much, Viktoriya. It really does set the scene. Of course, to welcome Air Marshal Allan Marshal to look at this in terms of the perspective from the Air and Space Command.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to be here and be on the first panel of the afternoon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of ultimately my perspective on deterrence, a little bit of theory, a bit of practice. Very cognizant that that's quite slanted from a UK perspective, which is just one nation in NATO and one of many, many nations in the room. But hopefully you'll be able to get something from it. I guess I'd like to start with a reflection that deterrence is in being today. It's certainly in the Euro-Atlantic context. We're active every single day, defending, flying, understanding, as many other nations do elsewhere in the world. And as such, I think we can assess against Russia, it is effective. We know Putin has, ideas on bits of NATO territory. Clearly he's shown in Ukraine his intent in terms of, gaining additional territory back. But what we observe is actually Russian forces being fairly measured and constrained around NATO borders and proximate to NATO forces. So I think we can analyse that it is working right now, but we've got to be on our game and we've got to get better. I think you could consider that Russian land forces have been attrited quite a bit, but in terms of air, maritime, and certainly space, cyber, and information, they're still very, very powerful, and we need to keep on that game and clearly be absolutely alive to a regeneration of Russia in years to come. As has been mentioned, deterrence didn't work for Ukraine quite clearly, and again, it sort of goes to that sort of quote that I find really that actually it's the perception of the aggressor that's the most important thing here. So we suspect that Putin thought that he would easily take certainly Kyiv and a good amount of Ukraine. That was the perspective he had. So he went for it. He was not deterred. In reality, it's been a costly conflict for Russia, very protracted. NATO has expanded. Lots of nations are now spending additional money in order to defend against the Russian threat. So that hasn't worked, but the perception at the time was that was the right thing to do. Why was that? Maybe a lack of truth to power within the Russian system, maybe poor analysis. It's difficult to tell, but how could it have been different? I think, a more analytical approach, maybe clearly more significant or obvious Ukrainian forces. Maybe since the 2014 Crimea, sort of the grab of Crimea, some more substantial security packs. between nations might have had a deterrent effect. And clearly, it's interesting to think if Ukraine had retained its nuclear weapons in the early 90s, whether we would be where we are today. But again, all about the perspective of the individual leading the aggressor at the time. To touch on theory very, very quickly, I think people talk about broad deterrence and narrow deterrence. For me, very much broad. It's a whole of government effort. It's not just an air force, it's not just a defense, it's all arms of the security sector, and economic levers and diplomatic levers as well, if you are going to do it and, to the greatest extent you possibly can. And again, a general baseline deterrence is necessary, but you do need to dial that up. You need to change your readiness. You may need to increase your posture for a more immediate deterrence effect. And after the invasion of Ukraine, then NATO air policing ramped up significantly during the period. And those are the actions we need to continue to be ready to do to really, really demonstrate our resolve. And in terms of air and space power, a really, really important part of a nation's and an international community's deterrence effect. It's a key role ever since air power certainly came into existence. I think it's traditionally played an important role in deterrence. We have unique capabilities. Sometimes for politicians, the risk calculus of using air and space power is different to putting land forces in harm's way. We're pretty lethal when we need to be, and we're quite good at demonstrating the potential for that lethality as well. Sometimes it's easier in our environments than it is elsewhere. And we must remember that it's not just deterring enemy air forces or space forces taking action. That control of the air mission that's really come back to the fore is so fundamental to success in the land and the maritime environments that air and space power really, is almost at the forefront of the deterrence discussion, to affect that leader's perception. In terms of sort of some of the more pragmatic aspects and just some thoughts maybe to get towards what Air Marshal Greg was talking about in terms of, what do we need to do? The 4 C's are up there, sort of, to deter you need to be capable, you need to be credible, you need to make sure you communicate that, or it is communicated, and you need to make sure the adversary understands it. In terms of capability, all too often people are comparing the number of forces or the exquisite bit of technology they have. It's important, but it's certainly not the whole story. For me, it's the package or the overall system you have, the intelligence, the indicators and warnings, the command and control, the situational awareness, your ability to get that decision advantage. If you can persuade the enemy you've got that, they will probably fear you a good deal more. And we've got to think about stockpiles and logistics and resilience as well. If you look at the conflict in Ukraine, the really exquisite weapons are either out or in short supply. So we're pretty convinced others are looking at us to see what depth we've got in those high-end technologies. And then finally to industry. Again, wars normally last longer than you think they will or hope they will. And again, having an industrial base that can support the sustainment and the persistence of your effort in itself is important from deterrence. In terms of credibility, the adversary has to believe that you will and can take them on and prevent them from achieving their objectives. A lot of that's political and policy, governments demonstrating their resolve and intent. We can influence that as sort of military and air practitioners, but I think where we can really add value is actually in showing we've got plans. And, I use the example of NATO. A few years ago, I think we would argue that some of the NATO plans were quite loose. Over the last few years, they've really hardened up with regional plans. So there's sort of a bit of an automaticity to it, I hope, in Russians' mind now, that they know if this happens, the forces from these nations know they're going to go there to do these roles. That's the baseline plan. It might change, we might surprise them, things might change. But we don't have to go through that debate of who's going where, who's in, who's out. We've got a plan that they know is the baseline plan to roll out, which I think is a really significant step in NATO's overall effect. And then in terms of communications, you can have overt ones, indirect ones, replayed through others. The enemy will gather stuff through intelligence, of course. But I think in the air and space environment, demonstrating the capabilities we have, the capability, our ability, which is subtly different, our willingness and our resolve is really, really important. Through exercising, activities together, and of course, operations to really affect that perception. And I think, we sort of think about the deployments we do in terms of value for money. If we can go and do an exercise or an activity in a part of the world with some close partners to get better at fighting with them, to reassure regional partners that we're there and we will help out, whilst also learning lessons ourselves and deterring the enemy, that's a triple or a quadruple word scoring in Scrabble. You get great value out of that. So wherever we can, we should put a deterrence and a communication lens on whatever we do. And then finally, another paradox to join Air Marshal Greg's. When it comes to communications, in democracies, it's natural. In order to get money out of governments to invest in the defence sector, you sort of have to say where you're not very good, or where you're injured, or where you're wounded. Please send money, our stockpiles are not good. But as we think war may be coming closer, we need to be really careful with those statements. Clearly, you've got to justify money, but you don't want to be doing the enemy's intelligence job for them. So we've got to make sure some of our shortfalls are appropriately classified and withheld. And if you're going onto the sports pitch, you don't really advertise to the enemy who's your injured player and the treatment they need. You try to keep that close. So, it's a bit of a paradox for Western nations that need to argue for defence votes. We need to be really quite careful with those justifications going forward. And then just to wrap up, comprehension, mostly whether that's working, is one for intelligence agency and others. But the discussions we have do help our overall picture. And then I'll finally come back to partnerships, alliances, and cooperation. They are important. They make a real difference. And we are very much stronger together and can have a far greater deterrence effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Marshal, many thanks for that. So now I'd like to welcome Nicola onto the stage to talk about deterrence with the view of China and the implications.
Thank you very much. You'll be glad to know I don't have a slide, but if I had a slide, it would probably say one thing, which is that China is harder to deter than ever. That should probably come, and hopefully comes as no surprise to everyone in the room. I've been studying and watching China as a strategic military power, particularly in the nuclear weapons domain, since roughly 2003. And in that short period, there's been great transformation and change. China is is the most powerful nuclear weapon state it's ever been since 1964, which is when it first tested an atomic bomb. It's more diverse, it's more mobile, more precise in its capabilities. Particularly at the theatre, regional range, intermediate range missiles, China now has clear advantage over its rivals, including the United States. And we should expect that trend to continue. We should expect that trend to continue into 2035, into 2049. 2049 obviously being a very important period because that will be 100 years anniversary for the founding of the People's Republic of China. Right. Let me just unpack my opening statement by giving you two further dates to have in mind. And the first may not be as well known to you all, which is 2006. And 2006 matters because this is the pre-Xi Jinping era, Xi Jinping obviously being the current leader of the Communist Party in China. And in 2006, it was made very public, in Chinese language sources only though, that China wanted to have a closer than ever relationship between its defense and the commercial sector and industries and education. The idea of civil-military fusion, which is now slightly out of date in the Chinese context, was firmly laid out in this 2006 science document. And the rationale for it was also very clear. China did not want to be reliant on any other state. It did not want to be vulnerable or dependent on any other state for the development of strategic industries and capabilities. And Xi Jinping has carried forward from 2006 that mantra, that goal. And you can see that in all types of policies in the Xi Jinping era, from some more obvious ones to less obvious ones. I'll tell you some less obvious ones. If you want to become a member of the Chinese Communist Party, it's far better if you're a CEO or a senior member of a tech company in China. They don't want peasants joining the CCP anymore. They want CEOs of tech giants in China. Right? If there are more than 3 Chinese nationals who are working for a major company, they need to form, under Chinese law, a party cell. Right? Again, so that the party has a clear insight into what is going into that company if that company is of particular strategic interest. And remember, the PLA is an army not of the state, but of the army, but of the party. And Xi Jinping, like previous leaders, Xi Jinping is not an exception here, they have constantly reminded the PLA of that fact. So 2006 is my first big date that I wanted to share with you. The second is 2017. This, again, hopefully is not that surprising. This is when it became very open and very public, and China started to talk about itself as wanting to be a world-class military power, particularly in the strategic domain, so nuclear, space, so forth. That's reflected, of course, in the technical capabilities, particularly in the last 5 to 6 years. It's reflected in bureaucratic changes, organizational changes, so there are more brigades, for instance, now, for China's strategic deterrent forces. There are more missions attached to China's nuclear forces, which have been renamed the rocket forces. So that beyond deterrence, they have roles for counterbalancing, winning wars, seeking opportunities in crises. And the domestic value of these weapons, which is a big part of my research, has increased fundamentally in the Xi Jinping era. I don't expect you all to have heard of this program because it was a program in the 1950s, but it was a program that led to the atomic bomb in 1964, the Liangdang Yixing program. This program is now commemorated to unprecedented degrees in China. You will see Xi Jinping speeches several times a year referencing this program and saying that China, that the space scientists, the cyber scientists, even engineers developing high-speed rail in China should follow the spirit of the Liangdang Yixing scientists. So the connection to the past now is stronger than ever. Now, of course, there remain limits, and the project of becoming a world-class military, I think, is clearly incomplete, and that's especially the case in certain forces like the Air Force in China. There are clear issues around recruitment, retention, pension scandals in China's armed forces. There's a lot of corruption, and Xi Jinping has been watching very closely the war in Ukraine and the corruption issues in that war that Putin has faced. And of course, there is the general lack of experience on managing a world-class military across multiple domains. So where does that all leave us? And I guess this gets at this question of how to deter China when China is becoming harder to deter. Well, I would say that we shouldn't be so negative, despite the fact that China's capabilities will increase, and we should expect certain things that are very unsettling to continue to happen, like a deepening of relations between China and Russia, for instance, in the strategic domain. But I think there are things that are going in the right direction. I think the war in Ukraine, sent a strong signal to Xi Jinping that NATO member states, including, of course, the UK, were far more resilient and determined than they probably thought they would be, particularly on the economic front. And the sanctions that have been placed on Putin have had a very sobering and deterring effect, actually, on Xi Jinping. They led to a huge number of working groups being assembled in the party to discuss how to improve the resilience of the Chinese state, of the party, economically speaking, particularly as the effect of the war in Ukraine was that it became much more visible and much more public what the costs of a war over Taiwan would be for China. Of course, those economic costs would be much greater. Another area where I think we are going in the right direction is something like AUKUS. Now, regardless of whether AUKUS fails politically and whether we actually end up seeing those subs in the sea in years to come, it is already deterring China to some extent. It adds another layer of deterrence in the region because for the pure simple fact that it's creating, and already these are in existence, these relationships between Australia, between the UK, the US, in ways that China cannot recreate. It cannot have a similar AUKUS arrangement with North Korea, Pakistan, and Russia. And it knows what that loss is, because it had a very brief moment in its history, particularly in the 80s, or the 70s and the 80s, when its relationship with the United States was the best it's ever been. And they did have discussions, dialogues, and some agreements around dual-use technologies and defence. And China did start to see the value of these kind of close relationships. So China knows that something like AUKUS is very special and that it cannot have something quite the same. So let me end here to say that I think how the UK interacts with partners and allies through things like AUKUS, GCAP, really does matter and increasingly matters as China becomes harder to deter. Supporting Japan is probably the most important that comes to mind here. Japan's turnaround in its defence policy in the last 5 to 6 years, precisely the time when China's technological capabilities have really jumped. Japan's clear position on Taiwan, its clear view that any emergency there is an emergency for Japan, has had an incredible deterring effect on China. And supporting Japan's line on this from the UK's perspective, I think, is important, just as it is important to support South Korea, particularly, for instance, South Korea's small arms industry and its position, not least because both of these states, but especially South Korea, are worried and do need continual reassurance around the stability and security of their deterrence in an arena that isn't just about China, but of course North Korea and its nuclear weapons capabilities since 2017. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nicola Leveringhaus. Thank you. Okay, so questions have come in thick and fast. So first of all, a popular one from Julia Baum. If we're facing an axis of ill will, so to speak, how do we deter malicious intent before it escalates into unacceptable developments or activity? Marshal, can I ask for your take on this first?
Yeah, I guess, there we go, the microphone's live. So again, it sort of comes for me a little bit. If it's sort of sub-threshold malicious intent, it's that sort of grey zone activity. Funny old thing, that's the most difficult one to deal with, which is why the opposition does it. And again, for me, that's for the most part where you have that whole of government responses. There are military things one can do. You can do grey zone activities in reverse. But in reality, that's probably where calling out, in particular, attribution, ostracizing people as best you can, diplomatically, and economic levers of power will probably have the best initial effect. And certainly, I think that's within the rounds of certainly Western policy, the approach that we'd likely be allowed to take.
Okay, and there's a lot of interest in as well about the new UK Strategic Defence Review that's been announced by the new government. Do you see it as an opportunity or a threat to improving deterrence? Do you think the politicians really get the scale of the challenge, or will it just be seen as an opportunity to save money?
No, I think it's a most definite opportunity, really. You know, with the global environment the way it is, that's a really that's a pretty solid backdrop for us to explain what we do, the necessity of what we do, and the value we add. So I think very much, you know, there are always fiscal constraints, but actually having a fresh opportunity, unconstrained with decisions of the past, to really lay out what we add for the nation, I think is definitely an opportunity.
And just when it comes to kind of strategic defence reviews, Nicola, this chopping and changing of government, we know we're in a big election year, super election year, so many different general elections, presidential elections taking place. Do you think, you know, this hinders deterrence in the fact that budgets could be changed, direction of government policy could be changed? And that's in real contrast to what happens in China, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. I mean, China, I'm not sure it looks at the UK for the best example, probably looks at the US as the best example of chopping and changing rather than the UK. I think they would probably expect continuity from the UK in terms of the UK-China policy. Overall, I don't think they expect major change, for instance.
Okay, another question that's come in and is also very popular. In the context of deterrence, of being totally prepared to fight, is the UK taking support? So, for example, logistics, equipment support, engineering support, associated enablers seriously enough?
without getting into the paradox of giving too much away to our adversaries, I think it would be fair to say there are some shortfalls in those areas that we are very much looking to get after. And some of that is already in train, following the changing security context, following the invasion of Ukraine. So a lot of that funding is available to already do that. But again, that area will be a really key area of focus in terms of the forthcoming review, to make sure we can get the best productivity out of the platforms we have, and we can also sustain a conflict. Because I'll go back to what I said, wars generally last longer than you think or hope they will.
There's another question, Marshal, which has come through specifically about the defence review. Should we be concerned at the lack of air and space mentioned in the press launch of the SDR compared to ground forces and sea power? Should we all be talking to the government and MPs right now? It seems pretty clear from Ukraine what we should be doing.
Yeah, the defence review is going to take a number of months. I think the government has said we'll report in the first half of next year, and we'll have plenty of time to put the air and space story along with all the other elements of the security sector in the UK.
Okay, thank you. And Viktoriya, question for you. What is your view of Justin Bronk's assessment regarding the potential outcome of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the next 2 to 3 years? He was pretty pessimistic and stark in his warnings. What's your take on that?
Thank you. I was pretty sure someone's going to ask that question. Sometimes it's better not to have any questions during your panel. Okay. In all fairness, yesterday we had an interesting conversation, and someone was very positive, very optimistic about some assessments, and I was thinking this is a bit too much. So we need to be a bit more realistic with things. So we think what is happening on the front line, there are significant deteriorations, and that's what I was referring to, that the last 2.5 years, Western technologies, they had made a significant difference in the battle space, but Russians are adapting. That's why they could have counteroffensive, from their perspective, it's offensive in the Kharkiv area, and we had quite significant bloodshed in May when I was actually in Ukraine. So things were pretty rough in the area. Also, we see the increase of their use of long-range ballistic missiles. We see the great intensity. I'm pretty sure people saw what was happening before the NATO summit. They bombed the Children's Hospital in Kyiv. So the situation is deteriorating. And I think Justin makes an assessment, worst case scenario, so obviously it's one way to do it. I would be won't be sitting on the fence. However, I would say that situation is pretty tough. And this summer would be defined in many ways, so I agree with that. The same would be, we'll see what's going to be happening this year, but if you look into Russian tactics in terms of civilian infrastructure and things, they are bombing more strategically important objects of infrastructure. This refers not only to electricity infrastructure, but also industry, which they can find. So the situation is definitely deteriorating. I'm not going to be using the same statement as Justin did. Yeah.
Okay, it does play into a bit of what Mark Graper has put forward. Never try to outsuffer the Russians. How does the historical resilience of the Russian people affect our deterrence calculus? Do you have a take on that?
Oh yeah, I have a take on that. How much time do you have?
we've got another 25 minutes. Maybe not all of it.
Yeah, probably stop me when people get tired. I think the best way to summarize this is the words of our former Commander-in-Chief, General Zaluzhny, when he was saying regarding our counteroffensive 2023, and he said that there was a mistake in calculations in terms of how much Russians are reluctant to lose people. And his argument was that Russians, the life in Russia is very cheap. So, and they are comparing losses during the Second World War as the worst case scenario, but obviously we're not counting millions of their losses. So, which means what they lost in Ukraine at the moment is still acceptable for them. So again, in this case, outsuffering Russia, Yeah, it is a challenge. What are the solutions? Well, I have pretty straightforward solutions, but probably people here will not like those.
And they are?
When we talk about that air power is the most challenging thing for countering in the Russia-Ukraine war, obviously we shouldn't be forgetting the vulnerability of air power, which is when it's on the ground. So the core of the discussion is about what you can strike and what you cannot strike in terms of military targets in Russia. And we get into political discussion.
Okay.
So,
Marshal, do you want to enter into that realm of...
I'm sorry.
I have to ask.
I'm sorry.
So,
sorry.
that's all right, it's fine. I'll leave the political to Oliver, but I will come back to the resilience bit. And you know, it's something that I think both militaries and nations are getting to grip with. You know, it has been, so historically, you know, Russia has been particularly resilient in its population, and that's a whole of society thing. They're used to a different level of suffering, and I think, you know, there is a danger. It's been several decades since I think, you know, the UK and probably others have felt, you know, the sort of the level of concern we have now. So, you know, we are thinking through how do you improve societal resilience, and you know, even things as, you know, and it's actually less military. It's more how do you keep the roads open, how do you keep the fuel and the electricity going, and everything else. So, you know, I think, I think instinctively the population isn't as resilient instinctively, but very quickly in time of need, any population turns itself to that demand. And there's things we can do in preparation to hopefully accelerate that position.
Okay, thank you. And Viktoriya, the general in the first panel talked about the kind of changing attitudes, the kind of cultural differences, perhaps within military forces that are needed to ensure that those people at the closest to the action have that independence of thought and initiative and be given that by the top brass. Are you seeing that happen in Ukraine, that there is that element that's already been thought through, or you've had to adapt very quickly to it?
We're talking about military adjustments or society?
Military.
Okay, military adjustments. Well, one of the differences between, obviously, Ukraine and Russia had similar Soviet past. So one of the differences between Ukraine and Russian armed forces in terms of going away from the Soviet practices is that in Ukraine there were still some attempts to do systematic modernizations towards the NATO, towards the Western practice. Were they fully effective? For sure not, but in sporadic places you would see that, which allowed lower ranks or on the tactical level for people to employ mission command much more effectively than, for instance, was observed in the case of Russian armed forces in the war fighting over the last 2.5 years. So hence you can say that was one of the elements that allowed people on the tactical level to make decisions, to make adjustments. But as I said, it's not completely systematic. It's not across all of the armed forces. So you can see units that are super great at innovating because they would have a great commander. Then others would have some more rigid cases where someone would be from the good old Soviet school and would be doing the old-fashioned drills. So you would see completely different ways of war fighting than even if you have like exactly the same orders.
So yeah, this is a question that Phil has put forward. You know, which cultural aspects are associated with moving to the interoperability way of working?
Can you repeat the question?
So he's put forward, you mentioned the importance of equipment, communications and interoperability in dispersed operations.
Yes.
What kind of cultural aspects are associated with moving to this way of operating?
What kind of culture?
Well, you mentioned as well about the kind of old Cold War
yes,
ethos.
Yeah.
Compared to the kind of much more modern approach? And was there more success with a more modern approach?
We need to dig a bit even further. So before we had the Soviet approach in Ukraine, we had more historical tradition of mission command. Not mission command you would see in, for instance, in states, probably a bit closer to the German, I would say, traditions where mission command were taking roots. So we had it historically. People who would be operate on tactical level quite effectively. You see that with the revolutions that we had, people were organizing themselves. Many people who were on Maidan main square during revolutions, they would form some volunteer units. They would then join the war fighting in 2014. They would have already this kind of experience of organizing themselves, even if they were not military. But this ability to do things on the tactical level, decentralized, without strict hierarchy of command, that was a way for them to operate. And you would see that success of some of those units was actually derived because from those experiences where they had to organize themselves during the two revolutions taking place in Ukraine. So culturally, we have the historical context for that, but also the practical one of self-organization during the two revolutions. So I would say this would be some of the sources of the cultural specifics. Because if you look into Russian strategic culture, you would have this strict hierarchy, or you can derive it from the historical context of having Tsar and you follow the rules and you have micromanagement all the way to the ground. They are trying to step away from that. They are adjusting things, but still it's quite difficult.
Well, thank you for that. It's really great to get that insight from the field work. And I'm just moving back to really refocus on deterrence. Nicola, there's a question for you. Have sanctions really caused China to pause for thought? Russia has ridden that wave. Do economic sanctions really work?
No, not in isolation, and academic studies are quite clear now on that as well. So there's no expectation that they would. Just to add to the earlier question about resilience, though, I think China has been, again, mostly in Chinese sources, but very open about its sort of inside complexes and worries about the culture and the resilience. So I don't think it's particularly worried about social resilience per se, but it is very worried about the sort of personal will to fight. So I want to make a distinction here between the technical ability to fight a war, which China is clearly making advances in, versus the ability of the soldiers to not flee, right? To actually, for instance, if there is a, if an embargo over Taiwan goes badly and they have to, land on Taiwan, there's a real fear that soldiers don't want to actually fight in the streets in Taipei, right?
And do you think that has also been influenced, that concern over what's happened in Russia and Ukraine?
Sure, because of the lack of control, right, and the inability to contain a crisis and the need to go beyond certain options, right, which China would prefer, right. So I think there is, if there's any sort of lingering resilience question, it's over that very, very issue of will Chinese soldiers fight on the ground versus will the society be willing to tolerate high degrees of economic insecurity and so forth.
But obviously the current economic situation in China must play into this concern as well.
Certainly, but again, I mean, history is very recent, right? I mean, China has had huge periods of great economic success, equally huge periods of great economic failure. And they haven't been that long ago either. So I don't think, of course we don't know because Chinese people haven't faced the same degree of, pressures that Western and European, societies have faced. We don't exactly know, but the expectation is that they would probably be willing to tolerate higher costs, and that the propaganda, the nationalism narratives there will be pretty significant and probably likely very successful.
Okay, and another question for you, Nicola, from Christian Checkley. What do we understand about Russia but China's desired end states to be, and how do we use this information to deter?
So I didn't quite hear the first bit, sorry.
So let's take it just from Russia's perspective. What do we understand is Russia's desired end state? What does it ultimately want to achieve? And if you understand that, how do you use that information for deterrence?
What China understands Russia's end state to be.
China's end state to be. What does ultimately China want to do? What does it want to achieve? What's the overall objective?
In its relationship with Russia?
No, just overall in its military. In
the region, probably.
Yeah, in the region.
What they want to achieve.
Do you know what? Is Christian here? Maybe he can. He can.
So what its objectives are with it.
Well, do you know what? Can we get the mic to Christian? Because I'd like to get a little bit more detail. I mean, I think what Christian's ultimately asking is, what does China want to achieve in its military display of might and its military strategy. And so once we understand that, how will it help with deterrence?
Yeah, sure, it would. I think we don't quite know what the technology, how the technology translates into future strategy, right? So if we take the nuclear domain, which is the domain I do most of my work on, we don't know if China is pursuing a warfighting strategy and moving beyond a more minimal approach to thinking about nuclear deterrence. Certainly, the technology allows it to go into a warfighting position if it wanted to and abandon things like no first use, right? But it hasn't declared as such. It could do things that would certainly indicate that, which it hasn't yet done. So, for instance, it could put nukes on cruise missiles. It hasn't done that. Hasn't restarted production of fissile material. Hasn't done that, and certainly doesn't have enough in its civilian supplies to do that. So there are a number of things that it could do that it currently isn't doing, and that might be a more pragmatic and easy way to get an answer to that question. But equally, again, if you can read Chinese sources, China's been very open. Nobody should be shocked. And if you are, then you're late to the game. China has been talking openly since 2017 about wanting to be a world-class military power. It has never been a world-class military power. That includes having a comprehensive air force, navy, and so forth. Again, all of these things predate Xi Jinping as well, despite what we like to attach to Xi Jinping and his importance. So they'll predate him as well. They both predate him and afterwards, right? So I think actually on one level, at a grand strategic level, it's pretty open and pretty transparent. When you get to discrete strategies and doctrine, like in the nuclear domain and so forth, I think in the space domain, again, very open, that it's not beholden to things like no first use, which is essentially a politically restraining approach, right? So again, I think there is quite a lot of openness, actually.
Okay, well, thank you for that really detailed answer after the confusion at the start. But I think that was the overall answer that Christian was hoping for. So I just want to move back and focus on agile combat employment. It's certainly a theme throughout this conference. And as a question, how does the ability to effectively execute agile combat employment concepts support overall integrated deterrence, and what prioritised actions need to happen to support ACE interoperability across allies? Marshal.
I've got that one, yeah, cool. For those not fully aware, agile combat deterrence allows you to have sort of more geographic choice over where you operate your airplanes from preemptively or reactively in terms of dispersal. So what does it allow us to do? Basically, it makes the adversary's targeting challenge more difficult. Especially if you keep moving and you've got lots of choices, and from a deterrence perspective, you display your ability to do that. So I think it is a really, really important part. It's not particularly new. Decades ago we were quite familiar with doing that, but I know it's something the UK, I know NATO, and various forces in the Indo-Asia Pacific are looking at really. But yeah, it makes the targeting challenge difficult for the enemy. Ultimately, it denies them an easy way to achieve their objectives. In terms of doing it, yeah, we're on the steps to make sure we do have the ability to do that. And there's sort of two aspects to that. There's, in essence, survive to fight another day. You may wish to disperse, and once the attack or the wave or that threat is over, you may want to regroup normally, or there's survive to operate, which is more difficult, where you do disperse and then you operate for an extended period of time from those dispersed locations. And clearly you need the weapons, the logistics, and enablers to allow you to do that.
Okay, and Viktoriya, do you think the way that Ukrainian forces have employed agile combat employment during the campaign will actually act as a deterrence to show it's very much more difficult to achieve air superiority if that is enacted?
Well, I think the core answer to that is with the agile combat employment or dispersal, I'll just like one word. Dispersal, it's easier to achieve survivability of your air force. If you have survivable air force, you can increase the number of sorties, which means you can have bigger air power, you can have more effect, so you can have more sorties, you can reach more targets. Obviously, you need ammunition for that, you need sufficient air force, but the point is, with dispersal, especially with day one, with the first engagement, you make sure that your Air Force survives, and then it can be more effective across the warfighting for as long as it is needed. But as I said, you need to have preparation for that, and each country does it differently, because comparing dispersal that we had in Ukraine is different from what Sweden had, because it's part of the strategic culture in Sweden, for instance. The same with the Nordics. Obviously, we'll have this discussion that they have their own takes on things. So, yeah.
Okay, and I'd like to pick up as well, thank you for that, Viktoriya. Nicola has mentioned AUKUS and the deterrence aspect. What's your take on this? This is one of the questions that have come through from the audience. What is AUKUS going to achieve in terms of deterrence in the air domain? Drawing on what Nicola's already laid out.
Hey, look, so, AUKUS is one grouping of, like-minded nations in the defence environment, and there are many, such groupings, clearly NATO being the world's most prominent. And I think our adversaries are very jealous of that. They're jealous of our partnerships, our ability to interoperate together, the ability to learn, communicate, and all that. And AUKUS, I think, is another one of those things. AUKUS is not, specifically focused for deterrence, but it does have a deterrence effect, quite rightly, as do, as Air Marshal Greg said, conferences like this, get-togethers, all sorts of alliances, partnerships, be they bilateral or multilateral.
Yeah, and on that theme as well, Julia Baum has asked the question, can states in Africa and South America play a more active role in contemporary deterrence? And we talk about those geographical groupings.
I don't think, in principle, there's no reason why they couldn't and shouldn't. But I guess it's a matter of what level of effect they would add with the capabilities they have. What's their association with, I guess, both sides of a potential adversarial conflict. But yeah, there's that construct of nations coming together to be stronger together, to providing deterrent effect, I think is ultimately universal. And you'll note that Russia has tried to do that to a degree with some nations. Clearly we would view less successful than NATO and others, but I think it's something that others are jealous of and will try to replicate. Okay,
thank you. Nicola, I saw you nodding then. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, because from China's perspective, they're already, very much ahead, I think, in forging. I mean, maybe you know or you don't know about this, but China has the largest diplomatic force in the world, larger than the US, and it's held that position for some years now, which means that it has many more embassies and a huge number of diplomats. I mean, the diplomatic force at the UN alone is incredibly impressive. The point here is that they already have been engaging in Africa, in South America, in the Caribbean, to strategic ends, right? How can they set up parallel payment systems, right, with countries in South America, Caribbean, and of course, these are not going to undercut completely economic sanctions, but everything helps in building a patchwork system. Similarly, improving relations with Argentina, for instance, for access to Antarctica and so forth, for dual-use capability to gain wider coverage for its satellites, and so forth. All of these things, I think, China has been working away at for quite some time now, and I guess the issue is for the UK and others to be not just aware, but think about ways to circumvent that and undo the ability that China is increasingly building, right, to have a greater global presence and projection.
Okay, thank you. And a couple more questions for you as well, Nicola. Do we need to accept that the only way to achieve sufficient combat mass to deter China is to adopt lethal autonomous systems at scale?
I think it depends on the scenario, and it depends on the issue. I don't think autonomous capabilities necessarily are the only way that China. I think I already hinted that I think China will fight wars economically and in cyberspace and so forth and space, but also China very much doesn't relish the prospect of actual man-to-man combat and kinetic uses of force as well, right, over Taiwan. And the expectation is that it probably would come to that, which is a deterrent at the moment for China. So not investing in manned systems and so forth, I think, would be unwise.
Okay, and thank you. And we have a question which has come through from Air Commodore Mike Blackburn, who's the ex-defence attaché for China. Nicola, again for you. For China, is it all about Taiwan? Does Taiwan deliver Xi's great rejuvenation before 2049?
It's easy to latch on to the rejuvenation narrative. I think the problem with latching onto that is, of course, it then becomes very Xi-specific, and I don't think Taiwan is a Xi-specific issue. Deng Xiaoping said equally as sort of bombastic things about Taiwan as Xi Jinping, for instance. But I guess the point remains Taiwan is very central to, and it always has been, and China's been very open again about that. But as I tried to sort of suggest in my talk, I think what Japan does is becoming increasingly central as well, by their own design, of course. But and so China is looking very much at Japan. I think what South Korea does in the future might also become increasingly, depending on how South Korea changes or not its defense policies. But yeah, it is, of course, clearly very centrally about Taiwan, but not only.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Another question, I think, for the Air Marshal. Deterrence is based on perception, so how are Air Forces employing information ops to boost their hard capabilities?
Yes, I think increasingly so, and I think often those joint information ops capabilities are more joint, i.e. they're more done centrally in defence, and that's sort of the predominant model we have here in the UK. We have a central facility to do that, which can reinforce the information operational messages in all environment, and more importantly, make sure they're synergised. Because again, whilst an air and space conference, of course, it's the combination of effects that you can bring to bear across all of the services in the security sector that's important. So, each environmental arm doing its own information ops has some pitfalls as well as some advantages.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question. It is all we have time for, but it's a nice pivot to the next session. Can you see space-based capabilities being crucial for deterrence against Russia and China? And can you see this being extended to kinetic effects being deployed in space?
So I think, in terms of deterrence in the space domain, I think, we're emerging and learning in that environment. It's relatively new, but I think absolutely. Right now, space is quite fragile, so it may be more deterrent by punishment as opposed to deterrence by denial. But I think over time, there'll be deterrence by denial to protect our capabilities. And they will be fundamental. So more and more space is going to be dragged into the wider deterrence discussion.
Okay, well, many thanks. It's been a really great panel, lots of fantastic insights. So please do thank Dr. Viktoriya Fedorchak, who is, of course, Associate Senior Lecturer in War Studies. Fantastic contribution, thank you. Also Air Marshal Allan Marshal and Dr. Nicola Leveringhaus. Thank you very much.